I've come here today to talk about a slightly abstract philosophical idea. I realise that's a bit of a diversion for the Wednesday Lowy lunch, which is usually much more practical in its outlook. I also realise that many empirically minded people involved in politics think that political theory is at best a diversion and at worst complete nonsense. And political theorists themselves are most to blame for that state of affairs. They've spent too much time down too many postmodern rabbit holes. Much of the work that's emerged is impenetrable and dull. Excuse me, I think but naming things and then renaming them, classifying and reclassifying, categorising and recategorising is quite central to what it means to live in a humane and a civilised society. Without it, the humanities and the sciences, even art criticism, would be impossible. So I would defend the role of theory for its own sake, but I don't want to try your patience, and this is an institute for international policy after all. I'm mindful of a quote by Dickens, who said of one of his characters that from the nothingness of good works, she passed to the somethingness of ham and toast with great cheerfulness. Now, for good works, I think you can substitute the word theory. So today I'll try to pass from the nothingness of theory and give you some ham and toast as well by explaining how all this theory bears on the contemporary international scene. I think one of the core tasks for those writing on political international affairs is to articulate the vocabulary in which conversations about those matters take place, a task that's particularly urgent when trying to understand the changes that are undermining the old certainties of our world. Definitions and redefinitions will always be contested. There's seldom agreement on the new labels, never mind the old ones. But the international relations theorist Martin White pointed out that classification becomes valuable in humane studies only at the point where it breaks down. So examining the limits of our existing labels and proposing new labels can throw light on some perpetual problems relating to the way politics and international relations are discussed, and helps us to understand some of the new problems that afflict international politics. You will have seen in your invitation to the event today that I plan to rescue conservatism from some of its admirers. That immediately implies that I stand as an outsider to much of what passes for conservatism today, and that is indeed the case. A short list. In my work for the Lowy Institute, I have, among other things, opposed the war in Afghanistan, severely criticised George W. Bush and John Howard, more or less endorsed Barack Obama, recommended lower Australian defence spending, and urged Israel to unilaterally abandon its nuclear deterrent. And I admit that's not a typical CV for an Australian conservative. But conservatism, I'd argue, is not a set of abstract principles that lead to specific policy prescriptions. American conservatism, for instance, is typically associated with policies such as a strong national defence, an assertive and often unilateralist foreign policy, low taxes, small government but a large military, and a commitment to what are called traditional values. In the Australian foreign policy debate, we find the right side of politics tending to favour bilateralism, having less trust in the UN and putting greater emphasis on the US alliance. But I would argue that no ideology, no specific set of policies, and certainly no party allegiance is central to what it means to be a conservative. I'd lay out briefly four characteristics, key characteristics of conservative politics. The first is a distrust of utopianism, premised on the belief that governing is a perpetual, empirical enterprise that can only ever offer limited and contingent answers to practical problems. Conservatives have no grand design for the state or for the world. They see politics as a process of muddling through, not as a means to redemption or as a straight march to the sunlit uplands of an ideal society. An emphasis on tradition over ideology is the second element. But tradition, on the conservative reading, is not a storehouse of political wisdom or a consistent body of rules to be consulted as a means to resolve a given dispute. Tradition won't tell the government whether to lift the ban on live cattle exports to Indonesia or whether to withdraw from Afghanistan. In fact, if tradition was regarded that way, it would itself become an ideology that we could call traditionalism. Rather, the political philosopher Michael Oakeshott argued that tradition, rather than being a guide to political action, merely creates the context for political discourse. A simple metaphor for this view is that tradition is the rules of the road. Those rules don't tell me which direction to drive in, merely the laws I must obey in getting to a freely chosen direction. Traditions then don't prescribe action, they merely announce conditions to be subscribed to in acting. The third element of conservatism that I would nominate is authority, which has to be distinguished very clearly from power. The accumulation of authority is a slow social process and is not dependent on power. Authority can in fact develop completely independent of any power. The Oxford English Dictionary, for instance, is considered authoritative. It sets down rules about English spelling and usage, but no vote was ever taken, no approval ever granted, and no bill ever passed to confer that authority. The OED has no power to enforce its rules, just recognition from individuals and institutions that its rules carry weight and ought to be respected. In the modern state, authority and power commonly coexist, with the government having what's often referred to as a monopoly on the legitimate means of violence. But power and authority are clearly not the same thing. Power is the ability to coerce, and we submit to power because we have no choice. By contrast, people submit to authority because they feel it is legitimate. The fourth element, and underlying, I think, the other three, is the idea of society, or what the conservative political philosopher Roger Scruton called the social organism. Conservatism, said Scruton, presupposes the existence of a social organism. Its politics is concerned with sustaining the life of that organism through sickness and in health, change and decay. I'm going to come back to that theme. Now, conservatism, I think, is a readily used category in our domestic politics. In the foreign policy realm, the term conservative doesn't get used much, and there's no identifiable conservative school of foreign policy. So conservatives tend to ally themselves with the existing foreign policy schools. There's one group who ally themselves with the foreign policy realists, another with idealism, or more specifically one part of the idealist school, which is neoconservatism. Neoconservatism I think of as a kind of militant idealism. But I'd argue that neither of these traditional schools of foreign policy thought, realism and idealism, are completely comfortable homes for the conservative, as each one offends against at least one of the four characteristics that I laid out. Now, the case against neoconservatism is pretty straightforward and has been dealt with in various places, so I'm not going to dwell on it for long. The quite radical nature of the post-9/11 neoconservatism is obvious, it seems to me. William F. Buckley, the American conservative, once said that it's the role of conservatives to stand athwart history yelling stop. But the neoconservatives attempted the exact opposite. It's not that conservatism aims to block all change. After all, it was the father of modern conservatism, Burke, who said that a state without the means of change is without the means of its conservation. But it's one thing for conservatives to admit the need for cautious incremental reform. Something quite different is happening when the most radical and even revolutionary foreign policies of the new century are being promoted by and implemented by those like George W. Bush, who call themselves conservative. Far from yelling stop, the neoconservatives have been busy pressing the accelerator pedal. Neoconservatism is not really conservatism at all, because it's radical, highly ideological and utopian. It's also in love with power, especially military power, and often dismissive of traditional authority. The relationship between conservatism and foreign policy realism is more complex, and I don't argue that conservatives can't be foreign policy realists, merely that they can't only be realists. Realism and conservatism have much in common. Prudence is both a conservative and realist virtue, and they share a distrust of utopianism. But realism argues that the international realm is categorically different to the domestic one because the former is lawless, the scene of a perpetual Hobbesian war of all against all. International politics is the realm of power, of struggle and of accommodation, said Kenneth Waltz. He distinguished it from domestic politics, which he said is the realm of authority, administration and law. I can also cite a slightly earthier way to illustrate the distinction between realists and conservatives. It's been suggested by the American historian John Patrick Diggins He pointed out that while realists would agree with Henry Kissinger that power is the ultimate aphrodisiac, conservatives believe there are more satisfying ways to make love. Or let me cite a more familiar source of foreign policy realism, the Lowy Institute's own Hugh White. Last year, in the course of a debate on The Interpreter about Hugh's quarterly essay, Power Shift, he wrote, "To me, the whole difference between national and international politics is that in the international space, we don't have a sense of community embodied in institutions. We have armed forces instead." In subsequent correspondence, it's become clear to me that Hugh's position is a lot more subtle than that, but it is a pretty good encapsulation of realist theory. Recall what I said earlier, that for conservatism to have any relevance to international politics, we first have to agree that the international realm is a social organism in some respects. It's not that we need to prove international politics is exactly like domestic politics, merely that they share some important characteristics. I happen to think that's actually a pretty easy thing to demonstrate. We have in the international realm law-making bodies such as the UN and the WTO. We've got globally recognised norms like sovereignty and non-interference, even international diplomatic culture with its own rituals and its own lexicon. As the Queensland Liberal Senator Russell Trude recently said on The Interpreter, much that makes the global order work, to the extent that it does, relies on institutionalism, international air travel, delivering the mail, managing international banking, facilitating global trade, maintaining something like a law of the sea, and a great deal more would hardly be possible without functioning international institutions. Now, these institutions, traditions and common practices form what the great Australian international relations theorist Hedley Bull called an international society. Bull also called it an anarchical society, which reflects the fact that the international realm is only partially like a domestic polity, in that there is no global policeman and states do have to look after themselves when it comes to maintaining their own security and their own prosperity. But, the realists say, these institutions, traditions and practices have no real independent significance. Some realists will allow that they serve an important functional purpose at low levels. Delivering the international mail and getting planes to where they need to go are undeniably useful functions. Other realists say that traditions and institutions merely provide the stage for waging metaphorical war whenever that war isn't being conducted with actual weapons. Or they say these institutions and traditions are a veil, politely drawn around the brutal realities of the international power struggle. For example, realists would argue that that international borders are respected because the integrity of those borders is backed by threats of force. A conservative, by contrast, would argue that national borders are grounded largely on custom, with force playing a role only where custom breaks down. It's a difference in emphasis. In fact, the conservative, I think, would argue that the traditions and institutions of international society, far from being a veneer, form the core of international political life. Most human activities, in fact, exist because of shared rules and traditions of behaviour, which define and shape that activity. Enforcement of rules tends to be required only in exceptional cases, and for the most part they're observed out of a sense of shared norms, and because not observing them would lead to chaos. That's true even in the international realm, where rules are largely unenforceable and where judicial oversight is weak. A good example is the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, but there are countless others. So my argument is that traditions, the laws, the institutions which conservatives regard as critical to the functioning of their own societies need to be nurtured and protected in the international realm as well. There is such a thing as a social organism in international politics. The existence of this international society means there are enough similarities between international and domestic politics to make conservatism a compelling response to the contemporary international scene. With the rise of new powers and the end of American unipolarity, that task becomes more urgent than ever. To understand why, I think it's helpful to go back to the conservative philosopher Roger Scruton. And he said that it's the conservatives' desire to see power not naked in the form of politics, but clothed in constitution, operating always through an adequate system of law so that its movement seems never barbarous or oppressive, but always controlled and inevitable, an expression of the civilised vitality through which allegiance is inspired. Now, I think what Scruton's getting at here is the distinction between power and authority that I talked about earlier. Power is naked, but when it's clothed in constitution, power becomes tamed or sublimated. Now, Scruton was writing about the British Constitution, and we're unlikely ever to have an arrangement as comprehensive as that in the international realm, and it may not even be very desirable to have that. Nevertheless, the taming of power is a worthwhile goal, particularly at the present moment when power is shifting away from the Atlantic to the Pacific and the global order is shifting with it. The question of how to deal with China's rise and the eastward movement of the world economic centre of gravity illustrates how a conservative outlook can be of use, particularly where the utility of realism fades. Because the question of power is really only the beginning of managing a new Asia-Pacific and global order. Yes, it's important to recognise the way power relations are shifting, but in order to cope with that change, an emphasis on power relations is insufficient. Power and coercion alone don't make social relations sustainable. What's needed as a new global order emerges is the gradual and organic growth of common traditions and institutions of the kind that in our own societies prevent us from having to endure a Hobbesian existence where power and strength determines every question. Now, I understand that many on the right will be somewhat hostile to this sympathetic view of international law and institutions. There is a mistrust of multilateralism, for instance, in parts of Australia's centre-right, where it's seen as being synonymous with radical left-wing visions of a post-sovereign world government, and implies a surrender of Australian sovereignty to unelected international authorities. Now, that's a caricature, of course, and self-identified conservatives like John Howard and his Foreign Minister Alexander Downer took some important steps to strengthen Australia's embrace of Asian regionalism, for instance. And yet the mistrust is there. It was illustrated neatly a couple of years ago by the then Shadow Foreign Minister Andrew Robb. And again, I'm going to indulgently quote the Interpreter here. He wrote a piece for the Interpreter in August 2008. And he said, he was responding to a comment that I made about that I couldn't see a necessary connection between the liberal conservatism of the Liberal Party and the emphasis within the Liberal Party on bilateralism. And this was Robb's response. We don't see there being a one-size-fits-all, state-knows-best, collective, centralised, international rules-based system as being the priority direction in a policy sense. It may evolve, but it's not the starting point for foreign affairs. Now, that's a perfectly sensible response, but it seems to me that the use of terms like collective and centralised hint at the fact that Andrew Robb is tapping into a long-standing fear on the right that multilateralism is a cover for eroding national sovereignty. At the fringes of the right, and I don't include Andrew Robb in this category by any means, that fear morphs into conspiracy theories about one world government. Now, there are those on the left for whom that caricature is at least partly true. At its fringes, there are those on the left who argue that the existing international system based on national sovereignty is harmful to human welfare because it enshrines the rule of elites and frustrates progress towards a more just and more equal global order. And some see the current international order as an interim step towards a more democratic and cosmopolitan order in which the rights of people win out over the rights of states. But international society, in the way I've described it today, doesn't exist for that purpose, or for that matter, it doesn't exist for any extrinsic purpose. It hasn't evolved over centuries so that a particular view of justice or equality or harmony can be pursued. It's merely the framework within which states pursue their own objectives. The rules, the traditions, the conventions of international society reflect this proceduralist, non-purposive character. They aren't prescriptive, they just impose conditions to be subscribed to when states and their diplomatic and military representatives perform their freely chosen actions. They don't constrain sovereignty. To the contrary, they are the language and the tools which make the exercise of sovereignty practicable. I think it's that proceduralist, non-prescriptive character that lends an anti-utopian flavour to international society. Because of the radical diversity of its membership, international society could never survive the imposition of overarching purposes. Because its members could never agree on what those purposes ought to be, and would never surrender enough of their sovereignty to pursue them anyway. International society therefore defaults to the more modest aim of debating the rules of the road, leaving the direction of travel to be settled by individual members. So international society is certainly anarchical, but the international realm isn't chaotic. It displays many elements of the law and the tradition-based order that conservatives value in their own societies. And those are the facets of international political life which conservatives ought to protect. What needs to be nurtured is the growing, but I think very fragile, sense of authority carried by international institutions. Because the anarchical international order is strengthened and made more tolerable as the authority of its laws and institutions rises and the importance of power declines. Thank you.
Well, Sam, thank you very much. We have about half an hour for questions and discussion.
I didn't realise I'd spoken that quickly. I'm sorry.
I'm going to lead off. I'm wondering whether it's quite right to put law and institutions in the same category and to bundle them all together. As you said, I think you can rightfully argue that law does evolve, particularly the older parts of international law that has developed over centuries. But can you really say that about institutions? Institutions, for the most part, are 60-odd years old. With a few exceptions, they are creations of the post-Second World War world. And most institutions are the creations of a vision of what they want the world to be like. The United Nations is a good example. A vision, President Roosevelt's vision of what the world was supposed to look like, and this was a way of engineering that outcome. So I'm just wondering if it's quite defensible to put law and institutions in the same category.
Well, firstly, on the question of institutions being quite new, less than 60 years old in the case of the UN, yes, that's true, and that's in a relative sense what makes them weak. One reason that they are weak from the conservative perspective, but it's a start. I mean, you don't get to be 200 years old without being 60 years old first, I guess. Also, there are two ways to understand the term institutions. One is that, I guess, that formal bricks and mortar definition of institutions as, buildings and groupings of people getting together. The other is a slightly broader interpretation. So, for instance, I think of the idea of sovereignty, for instance, as an institution of the international order, and non-interference, for instance, which is a very old idea, which you can trace back to the Treaty of Westphalia and maybe before. I think those as institutions. On the question of the UN being founded on a vision, I think that's true to a degree, but the UN works, as an example, works in two ways. And here I draw on my own background with academic background working on the conservative political philosopher Michael Oakeshott, who argued that there are two ways to understand any human activity. One is as a civil association and one is as a purposive association. Now, purposive associations are ones where people get together to strive for a common aim. And from the gist of your question, you're arguing that's what the UN is. But I would argue that the UN also functions as a civil association. Its members get together not to pursue any corporate purpose, but merely out of respect for a common set of rules. And so, in fact, I think over the short history of the United Nations, its purposive character has largely been overtaken by its character as a civil association. So by far the strongest element of the United Nations is the Security Council. And that is in no sense, to my mind, a purposive institution. It doesn't exist to pursue those Rooseveltian aims. It aims to manage the global order without any extrinsic purpose above that. And I think that's true of many of the institutions that were founded after the Second World War. They are non-purposive. They exist to establish and to develop rules of the road, not to decide which direction to travel in.
There's a microphone coming. Yep.
I want to thank you, Sam, for your very insightful lecture. And I just want to develop an idea. I think in domestic politics, you are really on safe ground if you have the notions of conservatism, liberalism, socialism. But if you go to foreign policy, aren't you a little bit on a ground that's slippery? You know, just think the arch-conservative Nixon opened the door to China, which would have been an anathema to every conservative thinking at the time, or the non-conservative Blair makes a deal with Gaddafi and the conservative bombs him. So I think what I wanted to ask you, these notions of conservatism, liberalism, socialism, whatever, can they be really safely transposed to international politics?
Well, I think that the thrust of my presentation was devoted to the idea that it can, although it probably hasn't been in the past, and the emphasis has been on terms like realist and idealist. If I may, I think the gentleman sitting in the front row, Owen Harries, is testament to how difficult it can be to actually transpose things like ideas like liberalism to the international realm. Owen, I know for some years, was associated formally with the Centre for Independent Studies, and it always struck me that it was difficult for an organisation like the CIS, which is in domestic politics devoted to a sort of Friedmanite, Hayekian, free market view of domestic politics, to actually transfer those ideas to an international perspective. And I don't think they ever resolved that difficulty. So I think that actually goes to your point. It can be difficult, particularly for liberals, to transpose their individualist philosophy onto the international sphere, particularly because in international politics, it's a unique area, because whereas in domestic politics, the state can be said to act as a kind of umpire that guarantees the individual rights and the individual liberties of its citizens, in international affairs, when the state looks outward, it acts as a representative of the collective, of all the people, rather than being an umpire among them. And so in that sense, it's already an awkward fit for liberals. But as I said, I think for conservatives, there's something to be said for trying to adapt the conservative disposition to international affairs, simply because I think the existing labels, the existing worldviews of particularly realism, go some way towards helping us to understand the challenges, in particular the ones we now face in the Asia-Pacific, but they don't quite get there. Particularly on this question of power, I think that realism ends where the utility of realism ends where the questions of power have been settled. But the upcoming challenges of the international order are, I think, largely ones of authority rather than simply power.
So, Sam, to take this conversation to one of the events that is occurring at the moment, the Arab uprisings, the Arab Spring, on your view, a conservative foreign policy would counsel non-intervention, staying out of it, allowing the existing established institutions like sovereignty to remain unchecked,
Well, I find it very difficult to come up with a specifically conservative policy proposal for any particular issue, even one as complex as the Arab Spring. As I said at the beginning, I don't think you can associate conservatism with a particular political party or even a set of policy prescriptions. It's in one sense you might say a worldview, or Oakeshott referred to it as a disposition, which is a little unsatisfying, I realise, as an answer. But I think on the Arab Spring, the natural conservative inclination is to counsel caution, and in that respect, Barack Obama's conduct during the Arab Spring has been quite conservative. And I know a figure like Andrew Sullivan in the United States has argued quite persuasively that in his disposition, in his approach to politics, Barack Obama is temperamentally a conservative, even if not in his political program. I think the weakness of conservatism comes in the fact that sometimes opportunities have to be grasped, and caution is not always the best policy. The outstanding example, I think Barack Obama's policy has proven to be about right in the case of the Arab Spring. The better example is perhaps George Bush Sr. and the Chicken Kiev speech in the Ukraine, where in the early part of the post-Soviet era, he urged the Ukraine not to split off from Russia, which of course was I would argue a conservative response to the events at the time, but in retrospect looks like an opportunity lost for American influence in the Ukraine.
I mean, just to press you a little bit on that, the conservative disposition you talk about, which is to almost assume that if something is of long standing, it is therefore legitimate and good. Isn't that a predisposition for not doing anything, not being able to distinguish between what is good, what is right, what is an opportunity and what isn't? Doesn't that take a great deal of analytical capacity away from conservatism?
I don't think the argument is that anything that's old is good. But I do think there is a sense of, modesty in this conservative disposition, in as much as conservatives believe that their judgments, their contemporary judgments and those of their peers are unlikely to be the last word on any of these questions. So Burke, for instance, said that society is a compact between the living, the dead, and those yet to be born. And so I think what conservatives recognise is that their decisions are not only, that the decisions of political leaders are not only made for the good of the citizens that they serve right now, but are part of a continuum with the citizens that preceded them and those that are yet to come. And so I think that generates a great deal of modesty among conservatives in their belief in their own capacity to judge these huge questions. And that probably generates a tendency to being overly cautious, yes.
Looking at that vision and applying it to a specific situation first and then to a question about a country, in the South Pacific and specifically in the case of Fiji, what would be a good conservative response in dealing with the current situation? And second, what kind of a country is China? Is it a conservative country, and is that conservative likely to last in your view? And what might, just give us a bit of an assessment, put your template across China and the way it's behaving now and how it might behave in the future.
I can see now I've been tempting these questions from the start, and I haven't prepared sufficiently for batting them back, but I find it very difficult to come up with specific policy prescriptions for individual countries that sound conservative, and I think individual conservatives can come up with radically different proposals for how to deal with a problem like Fiji. On the question of China, I understand that that translations of my favourite political philosopher Michael Oakeshott are pretty widespread now in China, which is an interesting development. Is it a conservative country? No, I don't think it is. My sense, and I'm not a China expert, is that it's an unsatisfied power and a country that feels like it's not emerging into great power status, but re-emerging to claim the status that it had before. So it's certainly not a status quo power, and going through some of the characteristics of conservatism that I listed at the beginning, I certainly don't think that China is conservative in the sense of being law or tradition based, and in that sense, I think to that extent, the Marxist philosophy in China still holds true. In that, in most important respects, Marxism means very little in China these days. But in that narrow respect, yes, it does. That at the political level, it's a rigid adherence to at least the name of Marxism that counts, and not any kind of deeper Chinese political tradition. I think I have to leave it there.
Owen.
I think there was
I was left unclear, though, to what extent you are advocating a conservative approach, a consistent conservative approach to all foreign policy, or merely describing what conservatism is. And I wonder how conservatism, how you would describe the suitability of conservatism to dealing with very great novelty in international politics. I mean, we've had one striking example of that in the last century, the novelty of totalitarianism. And in the 1930s, conservative British politicians failed miserably in their response to it because they didn't recognize it as something different from what they were accustomed to dealing with. Stanley Baldwin was probably the most Oakeshottian prime minister that a country is ever likely to have. But he and Chamberlain, between them, misread the novelty of totalitarianism completely. And I think this is a sort of problem about the limits of the suitability of conservatism of your version of conservatism to dealing with international politics arises. I'd like to hear you on the subject.
Yeah. On the first question about whether I was advocating or describing, I think the emphasis was very much more on describing than advocating. I think if I'm advocating anything, it's that I'm advocating not that politicians ought to apply a kind of conservatism template to any problem they happen to solve. What I'm advocating is that perhaps some of the theoretical architecture that thinkers and practitioners about international policy apply to the world, particularly realism, I think, get you part of the way to understanding the problems that we now face, but not all the way, and that conservatism can be some help. And in particular, on this question of authority rather than a focus on power. I've described that already, I won't go into it again. I absolutely agree that there's a problem, that among conservatives there's a problem in dealing with novel challenges. And perhaps you mean to imply that China falls into that category as well, as totalitarianism did in the... I would say, actually, as an aside, that perhaps one of the strengths of the Liberal Party in its philosophical makeup is that it combines the liberal and conservative tendencies in the one-party structure, and so perhaps can cope a little better with novelty than a purely conservative party could. I'm not sure whether an examination of history that claim actually survives a close examination of the historical record, but at least on a theoretical level, I think the liberal tendency within the small L liberal within the Liberal Party can actually help to balance out some of the weaknesses of the conservative approach.
Lady just here on the fourth row.
Sam, I think the last few questions and your answers have partly preempted what I was going to ask, but I'll proceed anyway in case you have something to add. Look, I recognise that you've said that for you conservatism is a sort of a disposition, an attitude, rather than a blueprint for practising a foreign policy. But despite that, is there anything you could say about how you would see a conservative Australian foreign policy? In other words, if conservatism were applied to pursuit of Australia's national interests, can you give us in general terms, rather than specific issues, a bit of an idea of how you would see a conservative Australian foreign policy?
Thank you. Well, I touched on this briefly in my remarks with regard to Andrew Robb and the liberal perspective on bilateralism versus multilateralism. It seems to me the more natural home for a conservative approach to Australian foreign policy would be in the Liberal Party, but I don't discount the possibility that that the Labor Party can practice a conservative brand of foreign policy, and in various times and places I think they have. One lens through which to see this, I think, is through the current leader of the Liberal Party, Tony Abbott. And it seems to me that Tony Abbott, who calls himself a conservative, is actually that his political philosophy, as it's described in his book, recent book, Battle Lines, it actually displays characteristics of two types of conservatism. One, I think, is a cultural conservatism. The other is what I'd call a civic conservatism. And it seems to me in the quite meagre evidence we have of Abbott's foreign policy views, you can see elements of both. What I mean by a cultural conservatism is a conservatism that's concerned with the defence and sometimes the spread of a particular national or civilisational legacy, which has got political and religious and even artistic elements. It sees those traditions, those civilisational traditions, as being the defining elements of a particular society, and it argues that the erosion of those ideas would lead to a loss of identity. I think cultural conservatism is marked by a sense of siege, the idea that Western civilization is at a constant threat, and most recently that's been exhibited through a sense of siege against Islamic radicalism. But previous to that, it came in the form of a battle in what was called the culture wars, a battle against cultural relativism. Now, my guess is that Abbott's cultural conservatism, and I do think he displays elements of that, is heavily informed by the events of 9/11 and by the stance that the American right took in the culture wars and in response, the neoconservative response to the 9/11 attacks. Now, civic conservatism, by contrast, I think is less about defending a particular cultural legacy and more about defending a political legacy, a political identity. It's a more liberal form of conservatism, at least in Australia, in that it's partly concerned with preserving and defending personal freedoms rather than a particular culture. But it's also focused heavily on the benefits of a rules-based order. Now, in Abbott's case, I think that civic tendency, that civic conservatism tendency, is on display in the way he describes in his book his gradual embrace of multiculturalism, because he says quite openly that he was initially very sceptical of the idea that people from such diverse cultures could embrace the Australian way of life. But eventually he says he came round to this idea that Australian institutions were strong enough, robust enough to take in all these differing cultures. So for me, the open question about Abbott is which form of conservatism, if he's ever Prime Minister, would be most prominent in his foreign policy. And I think the evidence from what he said so far is, to me, unfortunately, that the cultural conservatism has had more emphasis. But I think, for instance, in the remarks he made about immigration at this very stage a few weeks ago, the element of civic conservatism is still very strong about the importance of rule of law and of institutions. So for me, it's an open question still how an Abbott foreign policy would look from a conservative perspective.
Lady just down the front here.
Hello, my name's Britta Bruce, and thank you very much for an interesting lecture. At the beginning of the lecture, you drew very much the distinction and gave the good example of authority being the dictionary and then power. But I'm wondering if you can give us examples on the international stage, as some clear examples where there's authority perspective and power on the international stage.
Well, authority and power tend to coexist. I mean, in domestic politics, as I said, they tend to coexist. So the institutions of government within a given country, let's say Australia, tend to be both authoritative and powerful. That is to say, they win the assent. They have the assent of the citizens who regard them as authoritative. But in cases where that authority is rejected or at least resisted, they have the power to enforce it through force. Now, commonly in the international realm, the two things are separated. So authoritative international institutions, and the obvious example, as I said, is the UN Law of the Sea. Now, that institution, that body of law is respected, first of all, because it suits everybody to do so, and it wouldn't make much self-interested sense for any nation to radically, reject an institution like the Law of the Sea. But gradually over time, bodies like that build up a sense of authority over themselves, and it seems to me there's no clear or easy or straightforward process by which that happens, by which authority is conferred. It just happens that states and individuals and even non-government bodies decide at a given moment that a certain body is authoritative. Just to return to Oakeshott, he gave the example of quite an obscure example of the Marylebone Cricket Club, the MCC. Now, this is a small cricket club that eventually came to have power over the rules of cricket for the entire world. It's now changed, of course. We now have the International Cricket Council. But it's interesting to think how that came about. How is it that this tiny cricket club came to be the authority for the rules of cricket the world over? And it's simply because individual organisations, individual bodies within that constellation of cricket-playing bodies decided that this body is authoritative. That's all. That's all that happened. And so, similar things happen on the international stage. As I say, the Law of the Sea is just one example. But as Russell Trude said, there are dozens of everyday examples of where rules are completely unenforced, but nevertheless are considered authoritative.
Last question, gentleman at the back.
Thanks, Sam. Forgive me if I'm mistaken. Is China a party to the Law of the Sea? I don't think so.
I don't know. I mean, I
don't think so.
The United States has not even ratified the Law of the Sea.
I think two good examples about the Law of the Sea are that neither China or the United States.
I mean, the United States, for one, observes the Law of the Sea. Yeah.
But my question really was the difficulty of characterisation here of conservatism and other ideas about the way people see the world. Perhaps the difficulty is that most nations pursue their self-interest.
their national interests through pragmatism rather than conservatism or any other ism. Is pragmatism what you mean by realism, or is it something different?
I think the problem with the term pragmatism is that it implies that there's some kind of value-free technocratic solution to political problems. Michael, at a separate function recently reminded me of that old quote by John Maynard Keynes, that practical men who believe themselves to be free, I'm going to get the detail wrong here, of any kind of political theory are actually captive, are usually captive to some long dead political theorist or economist. So it seems to me actually impossible to come up with purely pragmatic solutions to political problems. You know, I mean, is it pragmatic to put sanctions on Fiji, or is it pragmatic to engage with the Fiji government? I don't know. Maybe both are in some senses pragmatic, but you're going to have to make some value-related judgments, and some sort of philosophical and, dare I say, even ideological elements are going to colour those judgments.
Well, Sam, thank you for that discussion. We, Owen and I, have been fascinated by your ideas on conservatism in international relations for a while. This is the development of an article, as I understand, and I think it's a very fine article. Ladies and gentlemen, please do join me in thanking Sam Roggeveen.